Hi, everybody. It is now 1 p.m. and I have started recording our session, just so everyone knows. And I would like to welcome you to Michigan Lakes and Streams webinar series. Thank you for joining us. I'm Melissa DeSimone. I'm MLSA's Executive Director, and I would like to, of course, start out by thanking the Glen Lake Association for sponsoring our webinar series. We appreciate their generosity. This series is being recorded, as I said, and we will have it available for you to view. I have created a YouTube channel for MLSA, so this will be on the YouTube channel, and also available on our website, mymlsa.org. So you can see it there too. This is a webinar feature instead of a meeting, so you do not have video and you do not have audio, so you can relax. Even though it's being recorded, we're not recording you, so you don't need to worry about that. I have, in this session, disabled the chat feature because I didn't want to miss anyone's questions. I'm routing you all into a panel that's called Q&A. And if you write your question in there, I can either type an answer to you quickly. I may interrupt our speaker if it's something pertinent and ask him for you, or we will also be waiting till the end for the bulk of the questions for our speaker to answer. So with the housekeeping out of the way, and without further ado, I am going to introduce to you Ralph Reznick. He is with the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy in the Nonpoint Source Program. I'm correct, right, Ralph?
That's correct.
And he's going to be speaking to us today about rivers, runoff, land use, some good things that we need to know. So thank you, Ralph.
Very good. Thank you. Thank everyone for being here. I hope everyone is well. This is the first time, I hope you enjoy my makeshift studio here. The first time I've actually been the presenter of a webinar. So I think it's going to go well. What I'm going to talk about today is actually, maybe I should start being the first time I've done this. And Melissa, I think you're going to have to take off the Glen Lake Association thing so I can share my screen. Ah, there we go. Is that looking good, Melissa? Taking that as a good. Okay. Except one more thing here. Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't get to unmute myself. Sorry about that. I'm
okay.
Still here. It looks great.
Okay, thank you. All right, very good. So what we're talking about today is what happens to rivers as land use changes occur. Many of you may have seen parts of this before if you've seen me speak before, so I hope it's not too repetitive. Hope I've thrown in a few new things as well. Streams, as you may know, when you're walking through the woods and seeing a pristine stream, have a fairly identifiable floodplain and a base flow in the middle of summer, and you know, the things that you might, the places you might like to fish or enjoy a babbling brook. As development occurs and encroaches on the stream side and into the floodplain, a lot of changes occur. More runoff is delivered to the stream channel faster. The riparian buffer is taken away. Flood flows go up, base flow goes down, and the stream degrades. The fish pretty much think it's Armageddon and look for new places to live. And in the worst cases, if development is intense, and some streams in Michigan have actually been paved. So That's not really very good for anybody. It's not a very good aesthetic, and it's certainly not good for the fish and other creatures that live alongside the river. So we're going to talk about what causes that and maybe some things we can do about that today. This is an old slide, but it's still very pertinent today. It was from a guy named Chris May, who did a study in Puget Sound to look at the effects of the size of the riparian buffer and the amount of imperviousness. And so this got used quite a bit, and it's a little messy. There's a lot of points here, but really what it's showing is that when you have very little imperviousness, 0 to 10%, which is where he made the cutoff here, you have very good stream benthic community, that measure, and also not necessarily because of the lack of development, but or perhaps because of the lack of development, the riparian buffer is still intact, and you have excellent quality. As development increases, as the amount of impervious surface is added to the watershed, benthic quality goes down. Now, the one interesting thing here is that at least in the middle, if the riparian buffer is kept relatively large, 60 to 70, 60 to 70, yeah, 60 to 70 meters, the quality stays a little higher. It's still degrading, where you have less buffer, even with this imperviousness, the water quality degrades quicker. The benthic measurement degrades quicker. So, and then as we get into 50 or 60% of imperviousness in the watershed, the water quality is very poor. That was in Puget Sound, but it's been repeated in other places. And that example has been used widely for a long time. It's still one of my favorite slides. A guy named Schuler, working on the other side of the country in Chesapeake Bay, made it simpler. He did some of his own studies, added to what May did, and basically said if you have 10%, if you go over 10% imperviousness, your watershed becomes impaired. And if you go over 25%, it is non-supporting. And then he even went further. At 60%, it becomes urban drainage. That's its quality. These numbers are good criteria to identify. And at the time he developed this, he didn't distinguish between whether there were corrective measures that went along with the amount of imperviousness. So some of the things we'll talk about later in the talk will mitigate the effects of this, even if you have these levels of imperviousness. But once you get over 25%, it's a hard thing to bring that back to a higher quality stream. And why is that? In forested, unimpacted, pre-settlement condition, most of the very little surface runoff occurs. Most of the water that hits the ground from a rainstorm is either evapotranspirated, intercepted, by the amount of vegetation you have, soaks into the ground, and that is delivered to the stream is done through subsurface flow that provides base flow. So you maintain a decent base flow. When you take away that riparian vegetation and build hard surfaces so that the water can no longer infiltrate as much as it did, you replace what used to go into the groundwater and was lost to evapotranspiration to surface runoff to a very great extent. You saw it was like 0.3% of surface runoff in an unimpacted condition, and in this example, in this calculation, 30% surface runoff. And that's all taken away almost exclusively from evapotranspiration and groundwater losses. A huge change. And the river has to try to adapt to that. And in the course of that, the water comes out of banks more often, causes more flooding and erosion. Just another example of more straightforward of how a typical development changes the flow pattern. And there we go, left that on. So in an unimpacted condition, the surface runoff is very small. Once you build and add all this pavement and rooftops and take away the vegetation that used to intercept and evapotranspirate, this surface runoff gets substantially larger, very, very much larger. There we go. Now, those of you who have worked in urban drainage very much know that one way to model the amount of runoff that you get is a method called the curve number method. We're not going to do any modeling today. I'm not going to do that to you. But the curve number itself, that portion of the method, is a good representation of the amount of runoff you're getting. So I'm going to use that in some of my examples. I hope you'll bear with me with that. And what you need to remember is the larger the curve number, the larger the runoff. So curve numbers vary from 40 to 98, and 98 essentially being pavement. And I'm going to be using those in some of my examples. So what should be attempted here is to reproduce the pre-development, or even better yet, pre-settlement, the unimpacted by human interaction hydrologic response. And there's three things that dictate that. That's the time of concentration, which is the time it takes a drop of water to move from the furthest point in the watershed to the point of interest, generally the stream. The volume that's generated, which is as it says, the volume. So the amount of water that runs off as things change will go up as the more you take away the vegetation and put more impervious surface down. And then the peak flow rate, which is how fast the amount of water hits the stream. The amount of water hits the rate of water that hits the stream. So this is where the curve number comes in. In an unimpacted stream, a hydrograph, so the amount of water that's discharged over time, looks something like this. In an unimpacted farm field, in this case, the curve number is roughly 70, and the time of concentration, the time it takes to go from one end of the field to the other, to the stream, is about 0.75 hour, 3/4 of an hour. That flow rate is 23 CFS, and the volume is about 5 acre-feet. And the curve looks like this. With not a very big development, residential development, houses, driveways, streets, the curve number jumps up to 86. Not as high as it could be, but still much higher than it was. The flow has gone up almost 3 times, the flow rate, I'm sorry, and the volume has more than doubled. And the curve looks like this. And you can see all this area under that yellow curve, and covering what's masked by the green, is the volume. That's the amount of increase it's seen. Excuse me. If we are basically not changing the time of concentration. We're running the flow still through yards and swales and not into curb and gutter and pipes. If we do that and cut down the the time of concentration to a half hour, the curve, the rate goes up much more to 90 CFS. The volume remains the same because all we've done is put the water that we've generated into a quicker conveyance, but we've shifted the time. So now we've made the peak rate much faster that's hitting the river, and it happens much sooner. So what we need to do is get this to look more, make the orange look much more like the green. That's what needs to be done. Why is that bad? Why is that bad? This is another favorite diagram of mine. It was developed by a fellow named Lane in the early 60s, I believe. And it's a scale that shows what happens when streams are in balance. Something you might not think about too often is that a stream doesn't just move water, it moves sediment. And in order to stay stable, which I will explain in just a moment, that sediment and flow have to stay in balance. And if we add more water without hardening the material that's in the stream, that pulls this end of the scale down, and you go towards degradation or erosion. You start to downcut and widen the channel. If you were to, for whatever reason, harden the channel for some reason, put a lot of riprap in without doing anything with the flow, you would pull this end of the scale down and you would cause aggradation. You would slow the water down and sediment would actually accumulate. So for when we send more water, as I described in the previous slides, we're causing degradation. What's stable? Stream is determined to be stable when it can maintain its pattern, dimension, and profile over time without a grading, which was filling up with sediment, or degrading, which is erosion. The pattern is, of course, the meanders everyone's familiar with in the stream. Dimension is what the cross-section of the stream looks like, and the profile is the slope of the stream, basically, and the bed features that go with that. Now these, first of all, are dynamic. They move, so these meanders may move in a certain direction, but the pattern itself stays the same over time. And same thing here, this bed form feature, this riffle may move further downstream and reform, but overall, the amount of riffles and the overall slope that's defined by that stays the same. And that's all defined, what we have found, what's been documented is that happens at roughly the 1.5 to 2 year flow event, peak flow event. So we can determine what a stable channel shape looks like. And we know that happens between the 1.5 and 2 year event. And we can define when can then look to see when that stream's not fitting into that stable form any longer. Just another word about Bankfull Stage. That is the stage where in a stable stream, the stream just exits, the water exits out into the floodplain. It's the portion, it's the event that does the most work. The most sediment is moved, and the most deposition and erosion occurs. Sometimes you won't see it though. You'll see a sand bed move. It could be picked up in the event, and it's chocolate and muddy and you don't see it, and a new one's deposited right where it was, and once the stream goes down, you may not even know. Or a whole lot of erosion goes on and you're seeing stream banks being eaten away due to high flows. This is just an example of where the floodplain is in a stable stream. It's easy to find. When you go back to that high curve number and high flow amounts from the land use changes that are not controlled, that are not limited, change the hydrologic response, this is what occurs. Significant erosion, where now this is downcut, the floodplain was up here. This is downcut, that base flow is much reduced, but during rain events, this channel fills up. Extra flow was put through this culvert as development occurred and ate away down here once this culvert was changed and allowed the increased flow to move through this area. And this is a major head cut. Where I'm standing up here is going to disappear over time. This head cut will continue to move further upstream as flows. As you see, this flow is not very large right now, but in a storm event, it becomes much larger and eats away at this bank. This whole thing is described in a channel evolution model. That was this particular one. There's a few out there, but this particular one was developed by Simon and Hupp, and it just shows what happens. In this case, it shows what happens when you create a drain. But the same thing would happen if the degradation occurred because of a head cut or erosion, because this channel no longer had the capacity to handle the flow that was now being sent to it from development. So the stream would deepen over time. It would slough off from the banks and begin to widen. It would downcut so far, and then it would begin to widen. It would and slough off the banks and add sediment to the system that it needs, that it wants, that way. As that occurs, a lot of that sediment is deposited, has the energy to pull in sediment, but it doesn't have the energy to move it, and it begins to aggrade. Over time, that material will aggrade back up, not at the upper level that it used to be, but in this lower elevation, and create a new floodplain and stabilize. Now, that all happens only if there is not either continued development or such intense development had occurred that that there is ongoing flashy flows and such high volumes that if this is highly erodible material, this will just be an ongoing thing, and this won't be able to stabilize. In a stream that is allowed to stabilize, this is what might occur. This is in a drain. This was dredged, but it was not maintained. And at one time, the drain was, let me see if I can, yeah, there we go. The drain was that wide. Over time, the sediment that moved through filled in and made this bench, and the stream went back to the size that it wanted to be. In this case, the only hydrologic change that occurred was that the stream channel was reconfigured because of the drain. If this had occurred because of hydrologic changes in the upstream watershed, this may not have been able to stabilize. It would still be in a state of chaos because of the continual high flows and volumes. So how do we address this? One of the first things that people think about and have thought historically, one of the first things people tackled was the peak flow. This is another representation similar to the first graph I showed you. For a 2-year event, that's what we're targeting in order to identify the proper hydrologic response. This red graph, this red curve represents an uncontrolled hydrologic pattern from after development. The green is the original undeveloped curve, and this pink one is a curve where detention has been applied. And what detention is just filling up a basin with water and letting, capturing the storm flow and letting it be released at a lower rate. That's very helpful. It takes away this peak, which is a problem. People recognize that early on. They've been putting in detention basins for decades. But you can see that underneath that pink curve is that volume we talked about earlier. And that is still far greater than what an undeveloped volume would be. So we have to work on addressing that to provide assured stability, stream channel stability. This is where upland techniques like lid and green infrastructure come into play. This is an example, the example I'm showing you right now is an example of a typical development, which you might see, where you have a lawn, driveway, regular street, and of course the roof of the house, and one where, which would be called a low impact development example, where you left as much of the woods intact as you could and provided a swale and a smaller footprint of both the driveway and the road. The idea here is to preserve the features that we're working in the benefit of the stream, that we're capturing the water. The woods intercepts the rainfall as it's coming down and picks it up from its roots and evapotranspires it. Less reducing the amount of pavement reduces the amount of volume that can't get back into the ground. A more detailed example is in this, where a very intense low impact development design was performed, where not only maybe this was limited, but they used porous pavement for, I'll talk about what that is in a bit. They conserved the trees. They used a rain barrel to capture the portion of the runoff from the roof, and rain gardens were used to capture the rest. Soils were amended. If the soils were very tight clay soils, they could be amended to absorb more water and not let it run off as quickly. And then a swale here instead of a closed pipe was used to convey drainage away from the house. Drainage is still provided. The house is high and dry, but the volume of water up to that 2-year event using this kind of design can be captured, and possibly even more if there's flooding issues that you'd like to address as well, in order to protect the stream habitat shape and keep it stable. So what are the techniques? One of the most simple is to control the time of concentration, that thing where the time it takes a drop of water to get from the point of the furthest point in the watershed to a point of interest. In this case, it would be after the stormwater pipe, but through this swale, is to maintain those natural drainage paths. There is no curb and gutter here. Curb and gutter intercepts the water immediately and puts it right in a pipe and gets it to the stream very fast. And it captures nearly all of the volume that hits it. This lets water flow to this catch basin slowly. It allows the water to infiltrate into the ground along the way. And if this is raised even just a couple of inches, it will hold water to infiltrate even further once it gets there as the rainfall becomes more heavy and more water accumulates there. This design could easily capture a 2-year storm and prevent it from getting in. Maintain the trees, the large trees in the canopy. You can also minimize the disturbance that you do. Don't interrupt the vegetation that's already there and has to be reestablished. And maybe that vegetation is more native or more rigorous, maybe woody shrubs in that. That would take a while to reestablish. Disconnect imperviousness, like your downspout. Don't let that run to the street. Run it through the grass, through this swale, and slow that down and give it time to infiltrate into the ground. And that grass, even though grass is certainly not as good for evapotranspiration as a tree, it's still picking up some water and using it and allowing it to evaporate. To go further, I think you've probably all heard of the term rain gardens, sometimes called bioretention. Bioretention is sometimes a little more rigorous. And that's essentially where you capture water in a slight depression and give it enough. If you don't have soils that can infiltrate, amend these soils down to about 4 feet. And also make a good planting soil for whatever vegetation you decide to use, and capture. You can make this large enough to capture a 2-year storm from, say, your rooftop or your driveway, sidewalks, things like that. At your residence, you can make them quite colorful and nice to look at. In a parking lot, they're established with curb cuts and intercepting. Instead of making traffic islands, you've now created traffic valleys and capture the water in those valleys. The vegetation varies depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Certainly when you use these curb cuts, you also have to have some grade stabilization and where the water comes in, and you've always got to have a bigger outlet. So remember I said that we're trying to capture that 2-year storm. Larger storms are delivered to some form of drainage system. Sometimes it's back out into the road, sometimes it's into a stormwater system. That you could use a rain garden to capture larger storms, but the primary purpose, you get into issues with holding more water and how long the plants can handle that. But you may want to do that in order to address flooding issues if you're having serious flooding issues. Same thing with a home rain garden. In this case, you can see right here a little outlet. A lot of the times, a home rain garden, notice it's right next to the road. You can barely see it here. Will run off, additional runoff when the rain garden fills up will run off into the road, which becomes the secondary conveyance. Just use less pavement. That's probably one of the most intuitive things. This is I've used this example for a long time. There's many more now, but it was a famous road out in the Puget Sound area, out in Seattle, I think, that narrowed the road, limited parking to intermittent spots, so you didn't need a whole lane on either side for parking. Sidewalk on only one side, so it reduced the amount of imperviousness for that purpose, and created bioswales or massive rain gardens on either side of the road to capture the runoff. So it didn't go into a pipe until it reached those larger flows. So, and this could be a simple thing in your design of your property. You know, how big of a driveway do you need? Or maybe you can use pervious pavement. I'll talk about that in a minute. So we talked about rain gardens. This is a compacted, highly engineered rain garden, so to speak. It's a tree collection device that basically routes water into a tree planting, or in some cases you can use shrubs or a variety of other deep-rooted vegetation, and direct water where you have a tight spot into these structures and grab the water there, just like in a rain garden. And higher flows would go down the street and into the first catch basin. Pervious pavement, this is the pervious pavement compared to the typical pavement, allows water to soak through it and into a stone subgrade below. You can see the difference here between the wet asphalt and how the water comes into the edge of the pavement and quickly disappears. This is purely infiltration, but that can be designed to capture enough water to make that act like it was a meadow. This really mitigates the effect of a parking lot and avoids the need to capture the water another way in, say, a large detention basin or maybe underground detention. This uses the space where parking is still being used, but capturing the water. Other configurations of this, by the way, are pervious pavers and geogrids. Rainwater harvesting, take the water out and reuse it. Let many of you have probably heard of or seen a rain barrel that you could put around your house, capture the water from a storm, and use it for your gardening or other purposes. Captured to a larger extent, can in some places use them for their toilets, for non-potable water, basically. You wouldn't use it to wash your hands, although there are places that use rigorous filtering. I don't think we can do that here in Michigan, but in some states they allow rigorous treatment of captured water and use it for potable uses. But for the most part, here in Michigan, it's either used for toilets or other non-potable uses if it's captured to a large scale. Green roofs. See I lost my green roof title there. Basically, make a roof act the same way as a meadow, in a different way than pervious pavement. Pervious pavement is capturing the necessary water on a parking lot and letting it infiltrate. Green roofs capture the water and let it evapotranspirate. It's purely a vegetative solution, but it captures the water everywhere you can spread this material, as opposed to letting it hit the roof and run off. Obviously, you can only capture so much. Most places, struggling here a little bit, there we go. Most places use a plant material called sedum. It's not planted in anything much thicker than an inch or two that's shown here, and therefore it doesn't make much weight. A lot more roofs can use it. It sucks up the water and allows it to evaporate, holds it until it can evaporate. Excess water then runs off, maybe into a treatment wetland or into a smaller bioretention cell. Oh, sorry. However, if you've got the structure for it, you certainly can plant more rigorous vegetation up on your roof. And some places have done this, and maybe even put a little walkway out if they have an entrance that can get out here and enjoy the vegetation they've got. Give it a little green space in the city. I don't want to, I want everybody to really think about the use of trees, just the use of trees, large deciduous trees primarily capture an awful lot of water. If you think about the total surface area during the summer, during full leaf out of a large maple, it's several football fields if you add up the surface area of each one of those leaves. So it takes a long time, and you may have noticed this, that when you are in the woods in a rainstorm, you hear the rain hitting, but you don't necessarily get wet right away until it's been raining pretty hard. It's because that tree intercepts a lot of water. In addition, it directs the water that does hit it right down into the root system, and the roots themselves enhance the infiltration capability of the soil, breaks up tight soils, and gives a flow path. But then it also sucks up water and allows it to evaporate. Purely planting trees instead of lawn provides a tremendous loss of runoff. More trees you can plant. And just to illustrate that, I'm going to use that curve number again. If we had open space on sea soils, and I didn't explain the different soil types, but sea soils are getting a little tighter, not quite as absorptive as sand, and not as tight as clay, but we're getting tight, harder, generate more runoff. Open space would have a curve number of around 79. So think lawn, and maybe not very healthy lawn. If we made that a woods, that would drop that curve number down to 70 and make a significant loss. So something to consider, as simple as, instead of trying to think about how big a hole to dig for bioretention and which plants to plant, which isn't that hard. I don't want to make it sound hard, but if you don't want to go through that thought process, planting a lot of trees on your property would be a huge help. So I want to go back to this for a minute, because I mentioned about the buffers, that even where imperviousness between this 10 and 25% impervious area was in the watershed was occurring, where the buffer remained high, the quality didn't go down as fast. So I want to talk about buffers for a bit. There's been several studies, and the studies vary. We did in the Nonpoint Source program back in the early 90s, mid 90s, I guess, we did a literature search at the time, and found that with the literature we looked at, if you have a buffer of less than 100 feet, impacts begin to happen. There were various impacts depending on the study. Some were wildlife, some were fish habitat, some were quality. But at 100 feet, you start to impact the stream in a negative way, reducing the buffer. And this, I still think, is an excellent example. This was an old NRCS, National Resource Conservation Service, example of a proper buffer zone, three urban buffer zones. So your house is up here, and at the edge of your house, you still have lawn, but you're not building here. You might have a fence, you might have a pathway that's not paved, but you're not making this an impervious, an additional runoff generator. You have a middle zone, which has limited use, but is primarily trees and heavy prairie vegetation, high, deep-rooted vegetation, bushes, that type of thing. And then a protected, and this zone is roughly 75 feet. This zone is 25 feet at a minimum. The more you can expand all of these, this says 50 to 100, the better. The stream side zone is untouched. Other than you might want to, if you live on a river, you might want to select the vegetation to have something a little more desirable, but it's not, this is left alone, and not used, at least not, designated paths are not run through it, and that type of thing. This turns out to be very protective of the stream and provides other benefits, wildlife benefits. Wisconsin went way more detail than that, but it's a good example. It shows how the water quality benefits are actually handled, can be handled with the very close stream side zone of 25 to 50 feet. Here, they, the minimum is down around 20. Previous guidance for filter strips, the minimum distance was 20, but all that did, with dense grass, all that really did was keep sediment from, that was on a farm field or something nearby, from going directly into the stream. Adding width and more rigorous vegetation like trees, like bushes, provide higher quality, remove more of the water that's being directed to it, stop more of the pollutants, provide additional habitat, and depending on how big the stream is, possibly temperature benefits and other benefits as well. So, but if you want to get into wildlife benefits, the stream side buffer is substantially larger. This is recommending is, as high as 800 or 900 feet. Minimum goes to 400 or 500 feet in order to provide different types of wildlife habitat. So after you've done all that though, if you can affect the hydrology, even if you could restore it in downtown Detroit or downtown Chicago, if you could restore the hydrology, a lot of the streams to the pre-settlement rate, a lot of the streams would be already impacted, and you'd either have to wait a long time for the stream to heal itself and live with the effects of that the stream would be causing erosion and habitat disruption while it did that, or you could start to help it. In a lot of cases, particularly where we deal with county drains, to add a little bit of feature, but where a stream has been degraded and has down cut and lost access to the floodplain that was up here, you could recreate, you could dig this out wider. There's a couple ways to do this. This example shows that you filled the old stream channel, but I'll show in a minute another way to do it. But you basically recreate the floodplain at the lower level. Dig that area out and give it the space it needs to remain stable. Let the stream develop bed features and pattern on its own. You may have to do that if the stream is going to take a long time to stabilize and take all that sediment with it while it happens. This is an example of what's called a two-stage ditch, which happens when you have a drain that's often constructed as just a trapezoidal channel. That's not stable for a drain. And when you do that, it will often slough, like I showed in the channel evolution model at the very beginning, and narrow back up and become the channel that it wants to be. You could enhance this. We know about how big this is. Where you need to still provide drainage, you can just dig those ditches. It allows the low flow channel to stay stable, prevents sloughing, but still provides the flow that you need to prevent flooding. So this is an example of where a two-stage ditch was dug, where This upper berm here came all the way over to the stream side before this work was done. And so this bench was dug here. As a result, now this was only done a few years ago. This stream hasn't narrowed up much, but it is developing bed form features and clearing out some of the sediment that had accumulated in the pools. You can do a similar thing by identifying the size of the floodplain necessary in a natural channel. You likely don't want to just do those. Constrain that channel, if it's a natural channel, to that tiny inner area. So this is an example of where a much wider floodplain was provided to a natural stream that's winding through this system. Now this doesn't look very good right now because this is relatively new and the vegetation hasn't established yet. But you can see where the floodplain has been dug down. These have all been dug. These used to be this high all along the channel, all along the stream channel, causing massive erosion around these bends and very low stream function. So this was a way to provide stability as long as the upstream hydrology doesn't change dramatically more from where it is today. This allows, when the flood flows, that 2-year event, that's where this bench is created. When the 2-year event comes through here, it goes outside the floodplain, the energy dissipates, and the stream channel stays stable. It might move, some of these things may move, but the pattern will stay the same, bed forms will develop, fish will come back, they'll love it, everybody all the aquatic habitat creatures will be happy, and life will be good again. Okay, that's what I've got. Are there any questions? I went through a lot of stuff, and did it briefly, so I hope I didn't go too fast.
No, you were great. I love your dancing elephants there. That's cute. We did have a question about the pervious pavement.
Okay.
It says, how does pervious pavement withstand in freeze-thaw cycles?
That's a great question.
Yes,
often asked. There's a couple ways to deal with that. For the most part, if you're not in a very high groundwater table to begin with, make your rock reservoir underneath the pervious pavement deeper. So the water gets through the pervious pavement quicker and goes into the rock and sits there to infiltrate. In some cases, you may have to put a drain pipe right in the top of the rock reservoir so that the water still gets down if you can't keep it very deep, so that the water still gets down away from the pavement. If it fills up enough that it gets close to it, the under drains will take the water away, and generally to a storm sewer system. So doesn't take out as much water as if you could let it all infiltrate, but it takes out a certain volume.
All right, that was good. Oh, we've got another question. Can high imperviousness lots be mitigated via French drains?
Yes, I didn't show that. It's very similar to the bioretention design, really, except for everything is underground. Sometimes we've built French drains with basically a rock. It's a rock trench, and maybe you can see the top of the rock, or maybe you plant that with some other types of vegetation, but the water's intercepted as it flows down the slope of the property, goes into that French drain, or it might be, there's two kinds. There's a Dutch drain and a French drain. One's horizontal, one's vertical. Some people route their downspouts into Dutch drains, into basically very round, deep wells that are filled with rock and allows it to infiltrate. So yes, that does work.
All right. We have a couple more questions coming in. That's great. Everyone, you can, feel free to type your questions as we're speaking. Sue asks, are drain commissions using two-stage ditches?
Yes. There's several good examples. I didn't show any of the, well, that last example was a project of ours that we had drain commission involvement. It's not a drain at that point. But several drain commissioners are experimenting with two-stage ditches and having very good results. Not everybody's using them yet. And it's not a common design feature yet. It would be good if it was a more regularly used design feature.
And I will add too, I recently was at a Friends of the St. Joe River meeting, and the local drain commissioner came and spoke with the group about ideas for a drain that was being made, that was being commissioned by the road commission. So the road commission spoke with them and said, we need a drain, we've got a budget for it. Can you design something? And he went and brought in the Friends of the St. Joe for some more ideas about two-stage and other design features that would help that drain. So that kind of relationship is important to be involved in, I think. So
that's excellent. That's an excellent success story that's getting used. I will add that in drains, a big feature that's attractive to drain commissioners is that it reduces maintenance. Really, if they're functioning right, if you get the design right, you don't have to clear out the sediment. The worst thing is on that inner bench, if you want to maintain drainage, you need to take out woody material. You can't have woody material on that bench. You got to have softer material, grasses and shrubs that can bend in the water. So, but that's a big, it saves money in the long term.
All right, let's see. We have, do your basic principles apply to surface water inlets to lakes too?
They do, but not in the same way. So streams are dynamic. So what were those mechanisms, that picture I showed of how a stream maintains its pattern dimension and profile, that gets messed up if you change the hydrologic balance. In lakes, the numbers would be different. You wouldn't necessarily do the 2-year event, although that generally also captures all the pollutants that are associated with the sediment that runs off. So it's still a good number to use, but it has more to do with your lake level and pollutants that are carried off with the runoff. Now the buffers are a different story. The buffers are about the same. The more buffer you can provide, the material might be a little different on a lake edge, but the type of vegetation, but the more buffer, those buffer limits are very similar.
Okay, some more questions here. What are the options for drain improvements when farm owners prefer to minimize buffers? This question relates to agricultural land use.
So if I understand the question, probably you're thinking, if you're going to do a 2-stage ditch, you need to take away more land. So there's a easy rule of thumb that was developed by some guys down in Ohio that creates a 2-stage ditch that is basically the bench is 2 times the size of what the bankfull width would be. You have to figure out what the bankfull width is, and then if you do that and you make a stable upper stream slope, that's about a 2-to-1 slope. If that's very deep, you're cutting into somebody's land. So there are measurements. I didn't talk about entrenchment per se, but there is a way to measure how much you can bring those benches in to a minimum and maintain stability. And there's variables to do that. I'm not going to explain them in detail at the moment, but there's ways to do that, make them a little narrower. So depending on how deep you are, how close to the surface you are and how bad your erosion is. The other issue is if a farmer is already losing land due to erosion because of an unstable ditch, maybe giving up a little bit right up front so you don't lose more later maybe isn't such a bad idea. There are ways to pull it in a little tighter, but otherwise it's about a 2-to-1 slope on the slope and 3 times the bank full width for the bank. Sorry, that was a long answer, and a lot of it is it depends on how deep you are, how much as you come up you're taking away more land.
Okay, let's see. With increased trees and fall leaves, do you have any suggestions for managing those leaves? That's
Mulch. You mean when they fall? Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
If you've got the space to do it. Some communities, my community takes my leaves away, and I can go get compost from where they take the leaves. So
Mhm.
that's not available to everyone. Maybe you need to do it on your own property if you have the room, but that's what I would recommend.
Okay, and then back to the French drains. It says with heavy rainfall events, do they overload or fill horizontal French drains? Is that a risk?
Could be, and well, all of the things that I showed you have a secondary outlet. They capture a certain amount of flow. We're targeting the 2-year flow. Most storm sewer systems are designed for at least the 10-year flow, maybe bigger. So that excess water has to go somewhere, and that's in that secondary collection system. Same thing with the French drain. What you'd have to be careful of with anything that's underground is that you try to make sure all the pollutants are out of it with some form of pre-treatment before the water gets there. And that's particularly true if you're running water off of a parking lot and in directly subsurface. It's better to go through like a rain garden or some other treatment that takes the nasty stuff out that ran off of the parking lot before it goes into the groundwater.
Okay, and then we have some other specific questions here. So this one says, are you familiar with the Boardman River breach at a dam upstream from Traverse City that they believe occurred in 2014? Since then, work has been done to restore the river to its original channel. Wondering about the advisability of this from your perspective. Is this a beneficial trend? The transition from dammed lakes to, again, a narrow channel is quite different. And that's from D.
Well, I believe where you put in a dam, that's an unnatural structure. Not that the lake doesn't act naturally, and we have many large dams, hydroelectric dams, and other purposes that certainly develop lake habitat. But that habitat was actually a riverine habitat and would be healthier if it was returned to riverine habitat. So where a dam is no longer useful, where it has no purpose anymore and would be very expensive to rebuild and maintain, yes, I very much believe it's better to put the stream back into a stable form, and to do that in a thoughtful way so that you don't cause other harm while you're taking the dam out or the remnants of the dam out. So that it's a little complicated in that there are some dams that still have a purpose. And sometimes that's, the houses around the lake. There's reasons to that, and there's a purpose to that there. But a lot of dams around the state, there's thousands of dams of all sizes, and many of them are no longer used for what they originally were used for. They're not maintained, and they're causing bigger problems than being used as a resource.
Okay, it looks like we have one more question from Tricia Denton. She's from the Glen Lake Association. In the Glen Lake Crystal River watershed, we're currently pursuing adoption of a special watershed overlay zoning by the 4 townships in our watershed. The Glen Lake Association is promoting adoption. The overlay district includes LID protections and limits on removing existing native vegetation, especially trees. Our hope is to have uniform protection of our upland areas too. Our lake is more than 50% groundwater fed. Well, that sounds good.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
See, there's an example right there.
All right. Oh, and some more questions are coming in here. Here is, I'm going to go to this one Oh, okay. What is a drain commissioner's primary responsibility?
Provide drainage. It's mostly the drain code. There's some other things in there, certainly to protect the water that's delivered from certain pollutants, but their primary purpose is to provide drainage. They should be doing it in a manner that's conducive to environmental protection and stopping any pollutants that might be transported to the extent that they can. But yeah, drainage.
Okay, I have someone who raised their hand, and I have not done this before, Alan, so we're going to try this out. I'm going to allow you to speak. So you are unmuted, Alan. You can go ahead and ask us your question.
You unmuted Alan, but Alan did not unmute himself, I don't think.
Oh, okay. Oh, wait, hold on. There we go. Now, Alan, you should be able to speak. That was my fault. Sorry. Alan, are you with us? Okay.
This is like a call-in show.
It is. It is like a call-in show. All right, we'll go back to these. Someone is asking, are there regulations regarding beaver dams?
Well, I guess it depends on what kind of regulations you're talking about. There are probably certain regulations depending on where you're at on how you would remove a beaver dam and what you have to do with the beaver. I didn't talk about beaver dams at all. In most cases, if they're not in an area where they're causing a problem, in some urban areas, an obstruction of any kind could cause some serious issues. But beaver are actually beneficial. Beaver dams in areas where they can exist without causing flooding of other infrastructure are usually a good thing.
Okay, one more question here and then a comment. So would you recommend using any invasive plant species to provide channel bank stability?
Now there's a trap there. Generally not. Oh, certainly not any invasive species. There is always a debate about what is truly native, because some vegetation that has become prevalent and not harmful, isn't really pushing anything else out to a great extent, can sometimes be useful. So there is that debate on occasion, but natives, to the extent that you can identify them and use them, are always the best way to go. Never an invasive, never an invasive.
Well, in my experience too, there's usually a native that will do what you need it to do.
That's right.
You just may not be aware of that native species, but it's probably available.
It would be pretty rare that you couldn't find the native, and generally it has to do with suppliers and who people use for suppliers and that type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then we have one more comment here. So Tricia says, not unlike the Boardman River situation, but on a much smaller scale, the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians is currently creating a plan for removing culverts on the Crystal River and putting in span structures that would reestablish passage for native fish species, and we hope to prevent aggradation created by artificial structures. So that's great.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And then any comments on removing historical structures and managing the transition to stream restabilization?
Well, there's two. I don't know exactly how to take the historical portion of that. There are issues sometimes, and in some places, it's very hard. In some other states, it's very hard to remove a dam if it's been there past a certain age. It's a historical monument, and it gets touchy. They're protected. They're not protected here per se, but sometimes if they're connected to something historically related, there's issues with that portion. If the question has more to do with just a structure that's been there for a long time, and how do you transition from this environment to a new environment? What is expected to be a more functioning, healthy environment, I would just say very carefully. Often in these dam removals up on the Boardman, there were a tremendous number of experts and contractors that looked at that carefully and did those removals very carefully and with great amount of extra effort to make sure that it went back into a stable pattern, dimension, and profile in the quickest way possible with the least disruption due to sediment release downstream. So, but that's tricky. And the bigger the dam, the harder that is. So those take a little bit of work.
And she clarified that she was talking about removing culverts. That's what she was talking about for historical structure. So I think you answered that. And then also regarding that, any balance needs of users and property owners along the banks, recreational boating businesses, etc.
Always. Every single one of these, and particularly in a dam removal, they can become contentious sometimes. You know, people get used to those things, and it often comes down to is the dam being used for anything anymore? But those discussions are almost always occur unless there's like one landowner who's just trying to take out an old agricultural structure or something. But yeah.
All right, and then we're going to pivot a little here. We've got the best approach for identifying phosphorus inflow if cost is a factor.
Wow. I guess it would depend on where the phosphorus is coming from. So phosphorus is often attached to the sediment. So there's ways to calculate. If you know how much sediment you're getting from upland sources, you could do a broad calculation based on what the expected phosphorus attachment to that type of soil would be. There are agricultural calculations or calculations that can be done based on application rates and soil types for ag fields. And it depends on really what you need to do. There's some very simple calculations that give you a decent estimate, but may not be very precise. If you actually took a sample after you were done, you might be off by an order of magnitude or so, but it gives you an idea of how much you're dealing with. If you really want to know how much phosphorus could run off, you're going to need to do soil tests and sampling if you really want a precise number.
Okay.
I can say one thing about that though. Stopping the sediment usually stops the phosphorus. So I wouldn't get too bogged down in phosphorus directly. I would try to stop the sediment first. And if you can do that, you're probably going to stop the phosphorus.
Okay, it looks like we have a legislative question about limiting wake boat usage on larger rivers. I don't know if you're able to speak to that though.
No, not really. At least not from how the law would be implemented.
I mean, I do know that we have legislation dealing with high waters and speed, but I don't know how far that extends.
And some local lake boards, put in slow wake rules like that. So I'm just not very familiar with the law and the intricacies of it, so I really can't address it.
And then the last one that we'll take here, is there any paper or book you would recommend for further reading?
Oh boy, because I really talked. This talk was the two pieces of my job that I like the best: the stormwater control of the upland areas and the river restoration part of the lower areas. And so for the river part, I would look up Run of the River, or A View of the River by Luna Leopold. It talks about all these mechanisms I was talking about in more detail, but also in a way that's not too technical. So I highly recommend that if you have an interest in that. If you're interested in the techniques that the upland techniques, the green infrastructure, I would look up, type in to Google SEMCOG low impact development manual, and that gives a it's not an easy, it's not like the View of the River by Luna Leopold that you read before you go to bed at night. It's more of a description of the practices, but it's a very easy description, and helps you particularly if you're trying to decide what to use, make choices in a very easy way.
And Ralph, if you could do me a favor, do you think you could type in those the names of those books into the chat? If you make it to all panelists and attendees, they should be able to see it, and then we'll also be able to record those as well.
And we'll see if I can do that. Ah, there we go. To the Q&A, right?
You can put it into the Q&A. That would be fine too.
Or I have the chat anymore.
Okay.
But maybe it's because I'm.
Well, if you repeat them, I can put them in the chat. What was the two that you said again?
A View of the River.
A View of the River.
By Luna Leopold, and that's L-E-O. Shoot, I might be spelling his name wrong. L-E-O-L. It's either L-E-O or L-U-P-O-L-V.
Okay, something like that. And then the other one was.
Oh, I see where you did it now.
Yes.
And the other one is the. Let me see here. Here, I'll do it. I'll do the next one.
Great. And Jack says thank you. And I agree. Thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome. I hope you got a lot out of it.
I know I did. And we certainly appreciate it. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We had a really good number of participants, and we appreciate that. Again, this will be recorded. Or this has been recorded and will be available on mymlsa.org and on our YouTube channel. Again, we want to thank the Glen Lake Association for sponsoring this. A big thank you to Ralph for his presentation today. And, you know, we hope everybody has a great weekend. We have another session coming up next week about high water. So I know that that will be a great presentation as well. And that is by Jennifer McKay. She's with Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council. So I'm looking forward to that. All right, so I hope everybody has a great weekend. Thank you.
Be safe, everybody.
Thanks, Ralph.
Bye.
Bye.